Isabella of Castile is often described as Spain's greatest queen. Her 30-year reign will see Spain transformed from an economically impoverished collection of feuding kingdoms into a unified state whose wealth and influence will soon make it one of the most powerful in Europe. Yet she's a figure that defies easy categorization. The truth is just far more complicated. If you've been following this series for the past 3 episodes, you've learned a remarkable number of things about Isabella of Castile. And I could tell you any 3 facts about her and give you entirely the wrong picture. I could tell you that she was a devout Catholic who darned her husband's shirts and tolerated his marital infidelities. And you might then assume that she was a meek and submissive figure who spent most of her time saying masses and let her husband run the show. This would be wildly untrue. I could tell you that she championed Renaissance learning in court, produced some of the most educated women in Europe, wore armor and visited her soldiers in the field, and reformed the legal system of Castile. And you would then imagine that she was an enlightened figure, a visionary ruler, far ahead of her time. And there are some who might still want to make this argument. But I must also tell you that she initiated the Spanish Inquisition, a period of book burning, imprisonment, torture, and execution that lasted for centuries and would tear apart the cultural fabric of Spain. This is that story. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast. You can catch this podcast anywhere you listen to audio, any streaming platform from Spotify onwards, or you can get the illustrated video version on my YouTube channel. Please make sure that you're subscribed so that you can catch up on the previous episodes and you can keep up with this one and the one that follows it. They say that no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. At least that's what everyone has been saying to me when I mentioned that I had been working on research for this episode and this series. And before we can understand why it happened, we have to understand a little bit more about where it happened and to whom. So we're going to back up and we're going to talk about the Jewish community in Spain, because if we don't understand their history and their position in the Iberian Peninsula, it will be impossible to understand how and why the Inquisition unfolded as it did. Jews were a large and ancient community in the Iberian Peninsula. And when I say Iberian Peninsula, what I mean is the geographic region that we now call Spain. But at this time, in the time of Isabella, and especially in the centuries preceding her, which I'm about to discuss in brief, it wasn't called Spain. So it was a geographic region, and there were multiple kingdoms that controlled various amounts of territory within that region. And Castile, the focus of our podcast, because it was Isabella's kingdom, was the largest and most powerful of these. This place, in the High Middle Ages, from approximately the year 1000 to 1300 Common Era, had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe. They were still a minority, and they lived under Muslim rule when Muslims dominated the majority of territory on that peninsula. And they also lived under Christian rule, as Christian kingdoms and rulers began to roll back the line of Muslim control throughout that geographic region. So Jewish communities were found all over, both when the area was ruled by Muslims and also under Christians. And in most cases, they lived in very near proximity to their Christian and Muslim neighbors. They had their own synagogues, they had their own communities, they observed their own religious rites and traditions. However, in Spain, as in other countries in Europe, Jews suffered from periods of persecution under Christian rule. Typically, when things became difficult economically, people looked for someone to blame, and that someone tended to be a Jew. By the 1300s, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, had stalked through Europe, taking an enormous toll on lives. But it wasn't just the number of dead bodies. The number of people who died because of that plague also had a knock-on effect. It meant harvests weren't brought in. It meant tradespeople disappeared. It had a huge economic impact. And the Black Death wasn't something that came and went in a couple of months. There were waves of it that impacted different communities in different countries over quite a long period of time. And so these effects were ongoing, and they were corrosive economically. This made competition for resources and positions more intense. To make matters worse, Jewish people often were already filling jobs that other people didn't want because they were unpopular, such as being a tax collector or a moneylender. Of course, the man who comes to take your money or to collect a debt that you owe is never welcome, especially when there is less money than usual. And so when times became more tense economically, typically the treatment of Jewish communities in Europe, and in our case in Castile, would worsen at those particular points. To make matters worse, in Spain, or Castile to be more correct, it was customary for monks and friars to whip their congregations into a frenzy around about Easter, because Christians, of course, remember the death of Jesus Christ at Easter, and they celebrate their hope in his resurrection. But there's a lot of focus in Easter sermons on the horrible manner of the death of Jesus Christ, and on the flogging and on the agonies of the crucifixion itself. And there was a tradition in Castile of many of these preachers emphasizing that Jews had been the ones responsible for flogging and crucifying the Son of God. And so it wasn't a coincidence that it was right around Easter when congregations of Christians had been hearing these horrible sermons in which Jews were the tormentors of Christ, the murderers of the Son of God, that bad things tended to happen to Jewish people more frequently at this time of year. And it was a vicious cycle. You can see how it worked. The preachers would be reminding people several times a year that Jews had been responsible for killing Christ. Economic times were harder, so competition for jobs and resources was more intense. And to make matters worse, then there was that Jewish moneylender or tax collector who was coming to take your money. And there was this narrative that was fed by certain parties in Castile that Jewish people were profiting from the poverty of the Christian population. Jewish people were the enemies of God, they always had been, and here they were collecting taxes and demanding money and doing better than poor Christians who were basically under their thumb. The reality, of course, was that it was Roman soldiers who flogged Jesus Christ and nailed him to a cross. And the reality in Castile was that Jewish people suffered from very extreme forms of economic restriction that their Christian counterparts simply didn't have to endure. But these were inconvenient facts that were not allowed to intrude into this narrative. The result of these repeated anti-Jewish messages is something that shouldn't surprise anybody. The result was first resentment, then hatred, and then inevitably violence. So pogroms or massacres or violence against individual Jewish people, beatings and murders, began to occur, and they began to occur more frequently. There was a massacre in the city of Toledo in 1355, for example. Now, this is more than a century before Isabella takes the throne. So I just want to remind you, we've gone back in time a little bit to look at the treatment of Jewish communities in the High Middle Ages and onward leading up to Isabella, because this is going to allow us to understand the messages and the history in play with the story that's going to unfold. So, a massacre in Toledo in 1355. And of course, violence, murder, and robbery from Jewish people was also happening in other cities in Castile on a smaller scale as well. And we can see this popular resentment begin to be reflected at the official level. So in 1412, there's a law passed in Castile that requires all Jewish men to grow long beards, and it also requires all Jewish people to sew a red disc onto their clothing so that they're clearly marked as Jews. Anyone who looks at them is going to know from the distinctively long facial hair and the red disc that's being sewn to the outside of their garment exactly who they are. This law also confined Jewish people to ghettos, to particular neighborhoods in the city where they were allowed to live and nowhere else. And this was something that was new. Jewish communities had often naturally clustered around synagogues, but there weren't laws that restricted them to living in some places only and not others. But this law in 1412 delineated very specific areas where Jews were going to be living and required them to be clearly visible to everybody. Does this sound familiar to you? Jewish ghettos, some kind of mark to be sewn on an external garment? It should, because in Nazi Germany, very, very similar things were done to Jewish people there as a precursor to the Holocaust. Those little yellow stars of David that people were required to sew on their clothes to make them immediately identifiable as Jews, the Germans didn't invent it. Here we can see it happening in Castile in 1412. This law also forbade Jewish people from holding a whole host of very important jobs. These jobs included things like doctor, pharmacist, and chemist, along with a whole host of other trades. Now, these awful laws were on the books, and they weren't strictly enforced. They were repealed, actually, only 7 years later. But the mere fact that they made it into law at all tells you something about the way that a significant number of people in the kingdom were thinking and talking about the Jewish communities among them. In response to these disturbing circumstances, many Jews in Castile chose to convert to Christianity. And this wasn't because they had a new appreciation for the grace of Jesus Christ. It was, for many of them, simply a matter of economic survival. The laws that were being implemented and the way that they were being treated were designed to constrict them economically, to prevent them from holding decent jobs, to keep them in poverty, and to mark them out constantly as targets for violence and humiliation just because of who they were. So some of them said, well, the only option here is to convert so that we can have half-decent lives as regular citizens. Some scholars estimate that at this time, between 1391 and 1445, nearly half of the Jewish population of Castile converted to Christianity. And when they did so, they became known as conversos. Now, this is a word that you've heard me mention in previous episodes, and it's a word that's going to be very significant for our story of the Spanish Inquisition today. So just remember, Jewish people who converted to Christianity were then called conversos. Very important. Now, this religious conversion allowed these people to have access to jobs that had been completely denied to them up to this point. Important jobs, such as city officials, for example, holding political office, even becoming church officials. Some of them obtained very high ranks within the Catholic Church itself. So these Jewish people who had converted to Christianity now had access to far better jobs, far more pay, and to positions of power and influence. But this did not go without resentment. And there were many people in Castile who were extremely anti-Semitic or Jew-hating, and they wanted to make a distinction between themselves and these conversos, these new Christians. So these people called themselves the old Christians of Castile. And some of them had an enormous amount of resentment for these upstart conversos who were suddenly obtaining high ranks that put them in positions of power over these older Spanish families. And these old Christians and others who harbored this extreme anti-Semitic idea were very happy to blame Jewish people, even if they were converted or conversos, every time there was a bad harvest or a grain shortage. So you would hear accusations of, oh, these converso Jews, these converted Jews, they're not really Christians, they're secretly Jews. And they've converted so that they can have access to power, and now they're hoarding grain. That's why we have a grain shortage, because those people over there are keeping it for themselves. So once again, there were waves of violence. There were massacres in 1467 in Toledo again, and also in the city of Cordoba in 1473. Now, interestingly, there are some records of educated people and certain aristocrats risking their lives to try to defend some of these conversos against mob violence in these situations. But sadly, the great majority of common people were still largely influenced by the Eastern narrative that they got on a regular basis, as well as rumors that were being spread in bad faith by some of the old Christian aristocratic families in Castile. It's in 1474, just 1 year after the massacre in Cordoba, that Isabella becomes Queen of Castile. And so she inherits this problem that's been brewing for centuries, of this anti-Jewish resentment, which is not abated even when Jewish people have converted to Christianity. 6 years after she becomes queen, Isabella and Ferdinand revive the 1412 laws that I already explained to you. The laws that require Jewish people to wear a visible mark on their clothing that identifies them and to live in particular ghettos in cities. So this applied to practicing Jewish people. It didn't apply to Jews who had converted to being Christians, of course. Now, you might think that this is a sign that Isabella and Ferdinand were incredibly anti-Semitic, that they would revive these laws that had been put away decades ago and hadn't really been enforced when they were announced in the first place. But that idea is contradicted by the next thing they do, because Isabella specifically makes it a crime to attack Jewish people, to beat them up, to steal from them, to kill them. It is a crime that is as intolerable as any other. And Isabella, as you may recall, was very interested in reforming the legal system and making it extremely efficient so that there was a short gap between offense and punishment. So when she says that from now on it's a crime to attack Jewish people, she means business. So it would be incorrect to interpret her revival of these laws that made Jewish people more visible and confined them to certain neighborhoods as coming from a malevolent place. Isabella wrote a letter to the Jewish community of Seville in which she expressed her intentions toward them. And here it is, I quote, "I take under my protection the Jews of the Aljamas," meaning the congregations or communities, "in general, and each one of them in particular, both their persons and their possessions. I guarantee them against all attacks of whatever nature. I forbid anyone to strike them, kill them, or wound them, and I forbid anyone to turn a blind eye if they are attacked, killed, or wounded." So understand that Isabella is not just promising to punish the perpetrators of violence. She's saying that it's a crime to stand by and watch as somebody else attacks or robs a Jewish person. That itself is an offense, to be a bystander and to permit it to happen. So this is a very strong statement in defense of a Jewish community, which desperately needed defending. Her words give no indication of personal animosity or hostility towards her Jewish subjects. And they took them at face value. Many Jewish people in Castile greeted Isabella's words with a great deal of gratitude and celebrated that they had a sovereign that they viewed as wise and just, and someone who was finally going to protect them. And unlike many of her subjects, Isabella harbored no suspicion of conversos, of these Jewish people who had converted to Christianity. Many of them held significant positions in her court, and in fact, one of her confessors, so we're talking about the priest who's in charge of hearing the confessions of the queen and providing spiritual guidance to her, one of those guys was a converso. So she made no distinction between new Christians who had once upon a time been Jewish and those who had been Christians in their families for generations. To her, a Christian was a Christian, at least at this point. Nevertheless, Isabella was dedicated to building a modern state and to unifying the country under the authority of the crown. Much of her reign is focused on doing that, And in the last episode, you will have learned that she and Ferdinand spent 10 years engaged in the Reconquista, which effectively removed Muslim rule from Spain. So Muslims continued to live in Castile, but there were no longer any kingdoms or cities that were ruled by Muslims. Muslims became simply subordinate citizens to the Christian monarchs of Castile. And it was during that decade, which we discuss in detail in our previous episode, that Isabella and Ferdinand begin to see their mission not just as building an effective state, but as unifying their kingdoms under a single identity. So they wanted their subjects to be politically unified under their authority, but also to be unified by a shared Christian identity. That was the vision. It was a vision that crystallized during the Reconquista, and it's one that is going to be critically significant in understanding the Inquisition. But visions of unity notwithstanding, Castile had always been a very mixed place. It was a place where there were Moors or Muslims, Christians, and very many Jews. And it's possible that Isabella and Ferdinand became aware that they might be viewed critically by other European states as a result of this, because many other European countries had formally expelled their Jewish populations during the High Middle Ages. Not coincidentally, when the Black Death was at its most damaging. England had expelled its Jews in 1290. France had done so in 1181, and Germany had kicked out their Jewish population in the 1350s. And yet, throughout Castile and Aragon, Jews were very easy to find. There was a very significant population, both practicing Jews and these Jewish Christians as well. In 1477 to 1488, Isabella and Ferdinand begin to receive reports from certain Castilian church officials. And these officials are alleging that there is a problem with these conversos in certain parts of Castile. These church officials are saying, you know, those Jewish Christians, well, in certain cities, they're only Christians on the outside. They've converted to gain access to better jobs and to important positions, but secretly they are still Jewish and they're practicing as Jews. And this is a problem. So to deal with this, Isabella and Ferdinand visited some of the cities where this problem was supposed to be most acute. And it was supposed to be especially in the south, in Andalusia, where certain high-ranking Converso officials were accused of being crypto-Jews. And how did people know? Well, they said things like, these people don't eat pork. They're not eating pork the way everyone else does. And that's because they're abstaining from pork because they're secretly Jewish. And their burial rituals still seem to have Jewish elements in them. So they're definitely not real Christians. And the church officials said that these secret Jews were a threat to the rest of Castile, to Christianity in the kingdom, because they would corrupt others. That having these people in high places who were really Jewish was going to be dangerous. It was something that had to be rooted out. So Isabella and Ferdinand visit these areas, and they become convinced that there is actually a problem, that there are some Converso individuals, families, who aren't really practicing Christianity the way that they ought to. So there might be a problem. But what should be done about it? Isabella and her Converso confessor, Hernando de Talavera, himself a Jewish Christian, were very reluctant to take any forceful action on this score. Isabella thought that perhaps more education would be the answer, that these people were relatively recently converted and that they just required better instruction to bring them into line with the correct practices of the larger Christian community in Castile. The royal couple wrote to the Pope in 1478, and they mentioned the problem, and they obtained permission from the Pope to begin an inquiry, an inquisition into the problem of Converso communities in Castile. But Isabella, even though she had this official permission from the Pope that would allow her to begin dealing with the problem immediately, did nothing for 2 years. She was very reluctant to use the powers that the Pope had granted her permission to access, and she was still hoping that better education and a campaign of preaching to these communities would solve the problem. So even though there's a disagreement between Isabella and her husband Ferdinand, Isabella is the monarch of Castile. So she's the one who has the final say in what is going to happen in her kingdom. And therefore, if she's reluctant, nothing happens until she's willing to sign off on it. Ferdinand is very eager to take a much more aggressive approach to this problem of conversos in his own kingdom of Aragon, but that story will unfold when the Inquisition really kicks off, which is not just yet. It's actually September 27th, 1480, when Ferdinand and Isabella finally sign an order that officially authorizes the Spanish Inquisition. And it's going to initially just be focused on certain areas inside Castile. Now, incidentally, this is just 1 year before these same monarchs begin the Reconquista, which we covered in our last episode. So it's right at this time, 1480 and 1481, when the same two people begin two massive projects, both of which have as their goal the fusion of political and religious identity. The Reconquista is about Christianizing the Muslim parts of Spain and taking those mosques and putting bells and crosses into them and making them churches. And the Inquisition is also going to be about making sure that everyone is the right kind of Christian. So it's not a coincidence that these two things are launched at the same time, and we're going to see how this quest unfolds in the hands of the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition was an utterly terrifying system, and it was designed officially to root out heresy in the Catholic Church. Now, before I got deeply into the research for this episode, I had heard about the Spanish Inquisition many times, peripherally, as I was doing research on the Reformation or reading different books about different characters in different historical periods. The Spanish Inquisition would come up from time to time, and so I'd heard about it sort of in passing, and I had assumed that it was primarily targeted at Protestants. Because when you said heresy from the 1500s onward, that was often what was meant. And Protestants do become the target of the Inquisition, but not until much later. Protestantism, the people who were following Martin Luther and the Reformation and wanting to overthrow the authority of the Pope, that wasn't what motivated the Inquisition in Castile when it started. Not at all. And you might have heard the Spanish Inquisition being lumped in with witch trials. And there were many witch trials, witch hunts, witch burnings that unfolded across various parts of Europe. And these were awful events. Thousands of people died. I mentioned some of these in a different series called the Salem Witch Trials. And of course, Salem takes place in the United States, but it is only a more late iteration of this much, much earlier European frenzy around burning witches. So you might have assumed that the Inquisition was targeting witchcraft or sorcery. This would also be incorrect. Many of the inquisitors themselves regarded witchcraft as a pitiable superstition, something that uneducated people believed in, but that no serious person would countenance. And so while there were occasional investigations of the odd witch here and there, the Inquisition was definitely not launched to deal with that problem. In fact, the true target of the Inquisition were the conversos, the Jewish Christians in Castile and Aragon. These people were resented in an ongoing way by certain old Christian aristocratic families, and they were still the target of rumors and hatred in many cities in Castile. And so now the whispers that these successful Jewish Christians were still doing something nefarious, were still at heart working against the Christian communities around them, was a rumor that just would not die. And sadly, conversos weren't just resented by old Christian communities around them. They were also resented by their practicing Jewish counterparts. Those Jewish communities that had not converted, that continued to observe their ancient traditions and had suffered poverty and humiliation and violence as a result, they weren't big fans of these Jewish Christians. They saw them as sellouts. So these conversos were not Jewish enough for the Jews, and they weren't Christian enough for some of the Christians either. They were caught between two communities, and they were going to pay an extraordinarily high price. Now, the Inquisition was launched after official permission from the Pope, as I mentioned, but the people actually doing the work, the inquisitors themselves, their clerks, their jailers, these people were paid by the state. This is an important point. While the Inquisition is supposed to be investigating religious crimes, it is ultimately an organ of state power. It is not answerable to the Pope. Even though there are some cardinals and bishops and friars, people who are part of the institutional church who get involved in the Inquisition and are appointed to significant posts, such as Grand Inquisitor, these people are answerable to the king and queen, not to the Pope. So the Inquisition is this strange fusion. It's an organ of the state designed to enforce religious orthodoxy. It's incorrect to see the Inquisition as some nefarious thing that the Pope cooked up and unleashed in Spain to fortify his own power. It wasn't the Pope's instigation at all. The Spanish Inquisition was the tool of the emerging Spanish state in its quest to enforce ideological purity and a single identity on its population. Now, in this episode, we're talking only about the Spanish Inquisition. There were other inquisitions or investigations of heresy, which took place in other countries at different times. Some of them took place in France long before this one, and the Inquisition or things like it spread to other countries later. So all the remarks and the information that I'm sharing here strictly pertain to the Spanish Inquisition alone. Estimated deaths from the Spanish Inquisition vary wildly. It's very, very difficult to get reliable numbers. First of all, because the Inquisition lasted for approximately 350 years, which is a staggering amount of time. And its activities were not constant throughout that time. It was most active in the first couple of decades, which are going to be our focus here. But through its very, very long lifespan, there were periods of greater activity and there were periods of relatively low activity. So it's very difficult to sort of generalize an average number of deaths per year or any sort of a steady amount of activity at all. Some scholars point to 2,000 executions in the first couple of years, and others cite a figure of approximately 8,800 for the first 18-year period. Many scholars cite a number closer to between 3,000 and 5,000 in Spain, but there's disagreement over these numbers, and the devil is really in the details in terms of how they're extracted and based on which particular pieces of evidence these figures are constructed from. We know that the victims were fairly indiscriminate. They included men, women, the elderly, and young people, sometimes as young as 13 or 14 years old. So how did it work? The Inquisition developed a formula, a standard way of operating fairly quickly. And once that formula was established, it was repeated again and again. It went something like this. When the Inquisition arrived in a city, a grace period was announced. This was a period of about 30 or 40 days in which people were told that the Inquisition had arrived, but they had this magical window in which they could come forward and confess their heresy, confess their wrongdoing, accuse themselves, or report heresies or wrongdoing of others that they knew about or had witnessed. Now, these activities would often include anything like Jewish prayers or rituals that someone might have witnessed or heard about. And people were threatened with excommunication or other forms of punishment if they failed to report heresy or wrongdoing that they knew about. So it wasn't just what you yourself had done. If you were aware that somebody else wasn't doing things correctly, or that someone else might have done something that was incorrect, improper, or unchristian, and you failed to report that, you could find yourself in trouble very quickly as well. So there's this atmosphere of fear that descends upon a city when the Inquisition arrives, because you don't know who's going to be accusing whom and of what. And in case you're unsure what excommunication was or why that was a problem, excommunication was a fate that was next to death in its severity. To be excommunicated meant to be thrown out of the church, as not a Christian. It meant damnation of your soul in Catholic teaching at the time, because if you were outside of the church, you had no access to the means of grace, and therefore you were damned. And it also meant social and economic isolation. You would be ostracized by your family and your community. You would be excluded from many trades and jobs. It was a terrible thing. So to be threatened with excommunication for failing to report something you knew was a pretty serious thing to contemplate. Inquisitors would standardly set themselves up in the local church on a Sunday, and they would read out the Edict of Faith. And this was a long list of practices or beliefs that they were looking for, things that were incorrect. So any sign of Jewish or Muslim belief and practice is something that they would be reading out. Now, I have to point out here that the Inquisition was not targeting practicing Jews or Muslims. If you were open about being a Jew and you were willing to suffer the humiliation and the economic deprivation that went along with that, then for the most part, you were not in the targets of the Inquisition, at least when it started. And similarly, if you were a practicing Muslim. If you were one of those people, then you were someone who needed to be preached to and converted. But you were not a heretic. A heretic, someone that the Inquisition was going to go after, was someone who had converted to Christianity, but then was doing things that were deemed to be Jewish or Muslim, having incorrect beliefs or practices after officially converting. Those were the people that the Inquisition was interested in. So the Edict of Faith would mention things like certain burial practices, a tendency to avoid eating pork, for example, or even a tendency to kill animals in a particular way. Because for Jewish people, there's a ritual way of slaughtering animals that is kosher, and for Muslims, a ritual way of doing it that is halal. So you can see that they were interested in people who were calling themselves Christians on the outside, but were secretly still slaughtering animals in a ritual way that was consistent with some other belief system. There was also a laundry list of other heretical ideas and beliefs that might not have been connected to these two communities in particular, but just anything else that the Inquisition was interested in. And there was also a list of heretical books that should not be read or circulated. So this Edict of Faith would take a long time to read out, and congregations assembled in church would be listening to all of this. And sometimes communities hadn't even heard of some of these books or ideas. And in some cases, this reading out of heresies actually had an unintended consequence of notifying people about books and ideas that they hadn't encountered before and became interested in. So as the decades wore on, the Inquisition trimmed back the Edict of Faith that they would read out. And they decided to not quite be so specific about all the wrong things, because sometimes they were inadvertently disseminating knowledge of some of these things to communities that hadn't heard about them before. But the purpose of this reading out of the edict was to tell people that anyone who had done any of these things should be immediately reported to the Inquisition during the grace period. And even if you just suspected that a person had done these things or had these beliefs, you should definitely report them as well. This included family members, and it even included people who were already dead. Now, the incentive here was that if you confessed, or if you came forward and said, I'm guilty of heresy, I've done this or that, during the grace period, that you could be reconciled to the church with a less severe penalty. So you could avoid being executed as a heretic. That was your incentive. So you would be punished, but it wouldn't be as severe if you just confessed yourself and came forward during this magical period. But if the period had elapsed And it was then found that someone had accused you of being a heretic, or that you had known that somebody else in your family perhaps was a heretic, now you were going to suffer very seriously. So as this practice was rolled out and several cities had the Inquisition visit and conduct itself in this way, the wave of panic would begin to spread. And so it was very, very soon the case that when the Inquisition arrived, many people would flee the city before it even showed up. Anyone who thought, you know what, I'm a converso, I know that my neighbors hate me, I'm getting out of town before these guys show up because nothing good is going to happen here. So we see these waves of kind of refugees, people who are fleeing the Inquisition. And by the way, in our previous episode, those individuals who were burned at the stake in Malaga, when the Reconquista happened and Ferdinand and Isabella took that city, yes, they were people who had been fleeing the Inquisition, and they had fled to a Muslim-ruled city to save their lives. Unfortunately, that mission would turn out to be a failure. But to return to the Inquisition, people who didn't want to flee would often come forward and confess because they were fairly certain that someone else was going to accuse them. And so if they just accused themselves before the Inquisition, then they could probably save their lives in this way. There were certain earnest people who came forward to the Inquisition and denounced anybody at all who they might possibly suspect of at all being connected in any way whatsoever to anything objectionable. So these people would cast a very wide net of accusations of neighbors and acquaintances. And as you would expect, there were a certain number of people who made malicious accusations, because the Inquisition was such an easy way to get rid of somebody who was inconvenient. So, did you have a land dispute with your neighbor? Perfect. Accuse them of saying or doing something Jewish to the Inquisition, and that would be the end of that. Did you have a rival at the university, someone who had a prestigious university chair that you wanted for yourself? Excellent. Accuse that person of heretical ideas before the Inquisition and watch them disappear, opening up the way for you to take that position that you so much wanted. So there were definitely a significant number of accusations that were malicious and spiteful in this way. The Inquisition provided a perfect opportunity for revenge. The Inquisition presented people with a mass version of what philosophers like to call the prisoner's dilemma. And there are many versions of it, but it goes something like this. Imagine that two people are arrested and accused of a crime, and the prosecutor visits each prisoner separately. And he says, if you confess, then you will be set free, but that other guy in the other cell is going to pay the full penalty for this crime. If you don't confess, you're both going to be punished. There might not be enough evidence to give you guys the maximum penalty, but there'll be some punishment for both of you, even though it won't be as severe. So what does the prisoner do? If he stays silent, but the other guy talks, then he's going to suffer the maximum penalty for this crime. But if he confesses, then he's going to suffer some punishment, but it'll be lighter. So in this scenario, obviously the best thing to do would be for both people to keep their mouths shut. If neither person confessed, there would be some punishment for both of them, but it would not be very severe. But the risk that you keep your mouth shut and somebody else accuses you carries such a high price that most people decide that it's better to accuse themselves, to say, yes, I'm going to confess, so that they can receive a lighter penalty, and that's all that can happen to them. They're not willing to gamble on the all or nothing game because of the high risk that the other guy will accuse him. So the Inquisition does this to people on a mass scale, with the twist that you might have done absolutely nothing. Many people were completely innocent of any wrongdoing, of any heresy, of any secret Jewish practice of any kind. But the risk that someone else was going to accuse you for what reason you didn't even know, jealousy, suspicion, anti-Semitism, that they liked your wife and they wanted you out of the way, you had no idea what might motivate someone to bring your name in front of the Inquisition. And so for many people, It was just a better bet to accuse themselves first. And the confession strategy minimized your personal risk, but it maximized the horror inflicted on somebody else. Because the Inquisition said to many conversos who came forward and accused themselves to save their lives, "Ah, yes, I'm so glad that you came forward to be reconciled to the church. As part of your reconciliation or your penance, you will need to name names of other people who are heretics." So this strategy of confessing to save yourself often only ensured a far more horrible end for another person. You could save yourself a severe punishment by assigning it to somebody else. You could pick them by name. Now remember that many of these conversos, these Jewish Christians who were the number one target of the Inquisition, had been coerced into converting in the first place. They hadn't converted because they'd seen the light and wanted from the depths of their souls to become Christians. They'd converted because they'd like to continue eating and not living in wretchedness and poverty, or being targets of random violence. But these people, while they might initially have converted for those practical reasons, had often done so a century before, in the 1300s or early 1400s. So by the time the Inquisition is kicking off in 1480, there have been several generations, at least two, in these families where grandfather might have converted from Judaism to save his property, but the mother and now the grandchild had been raised as Christians. They'd never known anything else. The idea that most of these people were truly secret Jews is not borne out by the evidence at all. This was just a suspicion that continued to be circulated by anti-Semitic parties inside Castile. So many of these people, by the time the Inquisition comes to interrogate them, are in fact sincere Christians. And some scholarly sources mention that these people saw themselves even as better Christians than old Christians in Castile, because as people who had had a Jewish heritage, they were far more familiar with the Old Testament and the Mosaic Law than your average Catholic. And so they saw their Christianity as being informed by both traditions and as being deeper and richer and more authentic in many cases. And yet, it's a cruel irony that even though many of them were very sincere, it was just because of who they were ethnically that they were going to become the number one target for this absolutely horrifying campaign. It was certainly true that there were other minority groups, some Muslims and some Jews more recently, who had been terrorized or coerced into converting for various reasons. But in Spain, once having accepted the faith, even if you'd done so under the threat of violence or coercion, it wasn't enough just to pay lip service now to Christianity. You had to truly practice it. And any slip from that, even if your conversion had been forced upon you, was regarded as heresy, and heresy was a criminal offense. Now, in addition to heresy, which was a capital crime, the Inquisition was also interested in a number of other smaller infractions, and these might be perpetrated by anyone of Jewish ancestry or not. So there are records of the Inquisition investigating things like bigamy, the practice of having more than one spouse. And this was actually a lot more common than you would think, because divorce was really hard to come by in Catholic Spain in the 1500s. It really wasn't done unless you were royalty and there were very special circumstances. So if you had a spouse that you hated or was abusive and you managed to separate from that spouse, good for you, but you were still married, which meant that if you found a new partner, and then of course people pressured you to marry that person because living with them and not being married was a sin, so you'd be pressured to marry whoever you were cohabiting with, now you were guilty of bigamy. So there were a number of these cases that the Inquisition looked at, as well as things like sodomy, blasphemy, saying something that was irreverent or disrespectful to the teachings of the church. These were also things that you could be accused of and there would be penalties for. But these penalties were by no means as severe as the ones that would be meted out to heretics. And remember, you didn't actually have to have done any of these things. All that was necessary was for someone to tell the Inquisition that they remembered you had done something like this. And it could have been 30 years ago. that they had heard you say something in a bar once that was blasphemous, and you had never done anything objectionable since that time. You might not even have made the original comment, but it was enough for a person to say something that distant and that ridiculous that one time they thought they saw you incline your head in a certain way that might indicate you were praying to yourself in a Jewish fashion, or in a bar you said something disrespectful to the Virgin, and that was all it took. And suddenly, you were hauled up in front of the Inquisition on these charges. Now, when a person was accused, they were arrested and thrown into prison. The Inquisition didn't build its own custom prisons. They would typically make use of the dungeon in the local castle of the city where they had landed. So these were improvised prisons that would be used for the prisoners of the Inquisition. And then the Inquisition would seize the property of that prisoner and do a complete inventory, down to the last kitchen spoon of everything that person owned. So that property was seized by the Inquisition, and they would sell it off in order to pay the expenses of feeding the prisoner, who could be in prison for a very long time, months, sometimes even years. But this practice often left a person's family in abject poverty. Because imagine, a merchant is arrested and thrown into jail, his property is seized. What are his wife and children going to eat? How are they going to feed themselves and clothe themselves? So the knock-on effects of this practice were often absolutely horrifying for family members of the accused who themselves had nothing to do with the accusation, which itself might be entirely made up in the first place. The Inquisition would have a file on an accused person, so they would have the person's name, and they would put in that file any evidence, any accusations that had been amassed against that person during the Edict of Grace. The prisoner would be arrested and thrown into prison and kept in complete isolation. The prisoner would not be told what they were accused of or by whom. So for some indeterminate amount of time, they'd be left in this prison limbo, not knowing how long they were going to be detained or how serious the nature of the offenses they were supposed to have committed was. And the not knowing, psychologically, that itself would be very difficult. But soon enough, the Inquisition would come around to interviewing the prisoner. When the Inquisition decided to interrogate a prisoner, he would first be seated and interviewed in detail about his history, his family, his employment, and so on. Then the Inquisition would ask the prisoner why he thought he had been arrested, and he would be invited to confess. Now, of course, the prisoner usually had no idea. This was an awful guessing game. But over a period of days, this invitation to confess would be repeated. If a prisoner did not voluntarily confess after 3 invitations, then a list of accusations, the formal accusations, would be read out against him. He could then attempt to respond. Now, an accused person had only a couple of ways that they could try to deal with this list of accusations, and one of them was to reject witnesses. So this was basically the prisoner trying to guess who might possibly have accused him of these things that had been read out. And if the prisoner could guess correctly one of the people who had leveled these accusations and reject that witness, then the Inquisition would cross out that witness from the list. But this was a horrible guessing game. You had no idea really who it was. So the prisoner was left in this terrible position of trying to list as many names as they possibly could think of, hoping that they would guess some of the actual names on the list and cut down on some of the accusations that had been leveled against them. An accused person might also try to call witnesses to his morality, and he could also try to provide evidence that the accusations were baseless. But these methods weren't very effective because fundamentally, the Inquisition presumed the prisoner to be guilty. That was the basic assumption. And the Inquisition also believed that it never made a mistake. So the success rate that an individual might have in trying to combat the list of accusations was generally not very high. And of course, torture could be used to encourage a prisoner to come up with a confession. And there were 3 methods of torture that were standardly used by the Inquisition, and these were even written out in some of the guidelines for the Inquisition by a certain Grand Inquisitor who will be meeting shortly. But for now, let me say that the 3 methods most commonly used were somewhat familiar. The first one was waterboarding. So in this method, a prisoner would be tied to a board with his head lower than his feet. He would then have a wet cloth placed over his face, and most importantly, his mouth would be forced open with some sort of insert. So the mouth was kept forcibly open, a cloth placed over the face, and then jugs of water would be emptied continuously over that person's face. So with the mouth forced open, the prisoner was forced to swallow this water. And it was a simulated drowning experience. And this could go on for a long time. There are records of, in some cases, many as 8 1-liter jugs being emptied into a single person's face. And this might sound not so horrible to you, like some gagging on water or some difficulty with breathing, but we have records of prisoners who suffered this fate. There's an account in a book called Nathaniel's Nutmeg that I read a couple of years ago of this very same method of torture being employed by the Dutch in the East Indies on an unfortunate British prisoner. And after the session was complete, this British prisoner's body had swelled up to twice its size. His eyeballs bulged out of his head. This method is not just horrifying at the time for the person suffering it, but it's horrifying for many hours and days afterwards. The second commonly used method of torture in the Inquisition was something that's sometimes been called the strapado. And this was a method of dislocating the shoulders. It was done by hanging a person by their wrists, which were tied behind the back. So the wrists are then suspended above the head, the arms are extended in this painful position, and the person can be left dangling there for some time, which is incredibly painful, but then also suddenly dropped. And the method here was to dislocate the shoulders, and this was awful. The third method is racking. And you might be familiar with the idea of the rack. There are some different variations in how this one works. There is a version of the rack in which a person is slowly stretched. It was often used in England in the 1600s. But that's not the method that the Inquisition used. That method of the rack would dislocate your arms and your legs by stretching you out. The type of rack that the Inquisition seems to have used most commonly was to tie a person down to a board, to have cords attached on the wrists and the ankles. Those cords were connected to pulleys and levers, and as you would turn the lever, those cords would grow tighter and tighter. So they would dig into living flesh and muscle tissue. And this was called the rack. And it was very commonly used by the Spanish Inquisition. So imagine for a second being a prisoner of the Holy Office, as the Inquisition liked to call itself. You've been in prison for months. You've been interviewed and asked to confess your crime, although you can't think of any. You have never done anything that was remotely objectionable. You're a practicing Christian, but somebody somewhere has accused you and you don't know who accused you and what they said. So you have nothing to confess. You don't know what your crime is. So the Inquisition decides to torture you, to make you confess. And perhaps they read out the list of offenses, but torture is used on you and it's only a matter of time. For most people, there's a certain amount of time that they can hold out, and then they're willing to say just about anything necessary to make it stop. So the Inquisition would get its confessions from people, and the Inquisition believed that it was never wrong. So if you were there, it's because you had done something, and they were going to find out what it was, and you were going to tell them. The point of a trial in the Inquisition was not to determine the innocence of the accused, because he or she was presumed to be guilty. The purpose was to make the prisoner confess. Now, if the case seemed to be based on false testimony, if the evidence saw that there was a pretty clear train of malicious accusations, and this did happen from time to time, the best a person could hope for was that they could be dismissed with nothing having been proven. The case could be resumed again at any time if some new accusation or piece of evidence came forward. But there was no situation in which a person was vindicated and declared to be innocent, because the Inquisition was never wrong. The mechanisms of detention, of keeping secret the accusations and who had made them, of trying to force a victim to confess, the mechanisms of detention, of requiring a person to guess why they had been arrested, of keeping the accusations and the accusers secret, of extracting confessions by torture before finally sending the victim off to public punishment or execution, are eerily similar to methods that were used in the Soviet Union and other totalitarian states. And the Inquisition prefigures a lot of these mechanisms at a far earlier date than you would have suspected these things would be used. There were three categories of victims. The first are those that there was not enough proof to convict. They didn't confess, and there wasn't enough evidence really to punish them. The second category were people who confessed. This was a large number, given the fact that torture could be used, or the threat of torture could be used. The third category were called the obstinate, and these were people who either refused to confess or who had committed further offenses after having once been punished for something more minor. For people in the first two categories, reconciliation with the church was possible. There would be some kind of a penance or a punishment assigned, but you could once again be accepted into the fold. If you were convicted of heresy in category 2 because you confessed, all your property would be confiscated. You could be condemned to any number of punishments. It could be hard labor. It could be time rowing in the galleys of a ship, or it could be time spent in prison. But even if none of these severe penalties were imposed, being reconciled still meant that you had been a heretic at one point. And that meant that there were certain jobs that were forever closed to you. Things like being a courtier, a doctor, a pharmacist. So there were ongoing consequences, even if you confessed and even if you did your time. This ban on holding certain types of jobs didn't just apply to the person who had once been convicted of heresy, it applied to their children and grandchildren as well. And that's interesting, isn't it? This is the point where the true target of the Inquisition becomes very visible, because its primary purpose was to target those Jewish Christians who had gotten uppity and who now were holding positions in society that some people resented them having. And so by accusing someone like that of heresy, taking away all the wealth that they'd managed to acquire, and then keeping not only them, but 2 more generations of their family out of these important positions, that accomplished the goal very nicely. But for category 3, those people who were called obstinate and refused to confess, things got far more severe. Someone who refused to confess his heresy, despite the testimony against him, was guilty of a capital crime. In these cases, the person was usually condemned to death. Curiously enough, this death sentence was referred to by the Inquisition as being relaxed. A euphemism if ever I heard one. And what it meant was that the Inquisition had found the person guilty of heresy and condemned him or her to death, but being relaxed meant that you were now handed over to the secular authorities so that they could actually perform the execution. And this was because the Inquisition liked to say that the church was not hungry for blood. The church didn't want to get its hands dirty actually lighting the fires. They would be there for the whole process. They would be the ones who would condemn a person to death, but they would want soldiers or secular state authorities to be the ones actually doing the executing itself. And the method of execution was burning at the stake. Now, this meant taking a living human being and strapping them to a post and building a great pile of flammable material around them and then lighting that material. And it's not a way of dying that went very quickly. It was basically akin to being slow roasted while alive. And people who were a victim of this would suffer for hours, and hours, sometimes screaming out in agony for more wood to be thrown on so that the fire could be enough to render them unconscious. It was an awful, awful way to go. Now, the Inquisition would allow some small measure of mercy if a person was willing at the last minute to convert to Christianity. So having been condemned to death, declared a heretic, and turned over to the state for execution, if a person said to the priest who was then accompanying them to the place of execution, or even while the piles were being built, that they now wished to be a Christian, then there would be a prayer of thanksgiving, and this person would have the mercy of being strangled before the fires were actually lit around them. And this is something that many people very practically did. We can't possibly imagine that these were conversions of conviction. These were just wretched individuals who were hoping to avoid a prolonged and agonizing way of dying. All of these things, the accusations, the public sentencing, and the executions, they came together in a signature ceremony that characterized the Spanish Inquisition, and it was called the auto da fe, which translates as the act of faith. And these were elaborate ceremonies. The one I'm going to describe to you is characteristic of these ceremonies at their height, which happened in the 1500s, later on, even after Isabella's reign ended. But those are the version that becomes best known, and that's the version I'm going to describe for you here, even though in the first couple of decades of the Inquisition, under Isabella's reign, these would have been much smaller, less developed events. The auto da fe was primarily a piece of public theater. It relied on a large audience. So the Inquisition would announce that they were going to be celebrating, yes, celebrating, an auto da fe on such and such a day. And typically they would try to make it fall on a public holiday, because that would be a time when people were taking time off work and crowds would be assembled and they would have the chance of a maximum audience. So they would announce it in advance, and this would be held in the public square, somewhere in the center of town where people could arrive in large numbers. The Inquisition would issue formal invitations to city and government officials who were strongly encouraged to attend. They were trying to get the biggest audience they possibly could. On the appointed day, the crowds would assemble and there would be a sermon and a mass ceremony that was said. So this public religious aspect to it is how it would open. Then the prisoners would be paraded in front of the assembled audience up to a large raised platform that had been built days in advance so that they could be easily displayed for the easy viewing of the crowd. And the prisoners themselves were marked by special garments that they had to wear, and these were called sanbenitos. Those who were condemned to death would be wearing black sanbenitos, and they would be decorated with things like devils and flames, so it was clearly indicated to the crowd who were the ones who were going to be roasted alive. Others who were condemned to lesser punishments, like flogging, for example, or other penances, would wear yellow sanbenitos, also decorated with various designs. And these sanbenitos were garments of shame. So for those people who weren't going to die, part of their sentence might be to have to wear the San Benito whenever they went out in public for some period of weeks, months, or years. And even when they'd served out their time, those San Benitos would then be hung in their local church, sometimes for generations, so that the shame and the humiliation of that person and their family would never be forgotten. Those who were guilty of minor offenses, such as bigamy, wore ropes around their necks with knots in them. And those knots, the number of knots in a rope, would indicate how many lashes they were going to receive when they were publicly flogged. All the prisoners had to wear special pointy caps and carry unlit candles. So there's this grim parade-like procession with prisoners in these very elaborate costumes with these hats and these candles going up onto a platform, and the sort of awful fascination of people looking at these individuals and preparing to witness the punishments that they're going to endure. But these were very long-winded ceremonies. There are accounts of auto da fes that are beginning at 7 in the morning and carrying on until dark, because the longest part of all was each individual prisoner having to stand up and hear the long list of offenses that were read out against that person, and then the penalties that were going to apply. So this took a very long time, and there was a public participation aspect as well. When a heretic was standing there individually hearing the charges against him, if he had repented, then he would make a public statement renouncing his errors, and the inquisitor would then read out key statements of faith that pertained to the areas that that person was supposed to have screwed up in. And that person and the crowd were supposed to answer, "I believe," in response to whatever statements of faith the inquisitor was making. So in this way, the individual prisoner was made a public example, but also an opportunity for the reaffirmation of correct practice and an object lesson in the fear and horror that would befall anyone who failed to keep this in their own lives. Now, the Inquisition was also very eager to ensure that no one had an opportunity to make heroic last speeches. They didn't want any martyrs. So for those people who had been condemned to death, especially those obstinate ones, who had refused to confess, because they were innocent and they weren't willing to go along and give the inquisitors the words they wanted to hear, the inquisitors were very concerned that people like that might take the opportunity when they were standing up there on the public platform hearing their sentence to make some speeches about the injustice of what had been done to them. And that couldn't be allowed to happen. So anyone that they thought might possibly have such an idea was gagged in advance. They were showing up in this procession with a gag already placed inside their mouth, so that there was just absolutely no way that they could say any words at all in their own defense, even in these last moments of their lives. So after these long ceremony of reading out accusations and making statements of faith that the crowd participates in affirming, the prisoners were handed over to secular authorities for punishment. And that was going to be done, especially if it was execution, in some other place. So not in the middle of the square where the auto da fe had taken place, but those prisoners would then be marched immediately to the place of execution when this main ceremony was done. And many in the crowd, of course, followed to witness that as well. It wasn't uncommon for people who actually weren't present to be burned in effigy as well. So, as I mentioned before, some people fled town when they heard the Inquisition was coming, but their names would come up as being accused, and they would be found guilty of heresy in absentia, and then they would have like some sort of a doll or a model made of one of these absent people and then burn that in their stead as part of the ritual. Even coffins sometimes appeared when those who were already dead were accused and found guilty of heresy by the Inquisition. So coffins or effigies of absent people could also be present, could be condemned, and could then be transported to the place of execution to be burned. Once the Inquisition had been in operation for a few years, and people got a taste of how it operated, the ruthlessness of it, the terror of it, and the fact that there was no real way that anyone could defend themselves against it, there were some people who decided that resistance was the way to go. In 1485, less than 5 years after the Inquisition had begun, there were several notable plots to kill officials of the Inquisition, and 2 of them succeeded. 2 inquisitors were killed in the cities that they were running the Inquisition. One of them was poisoned, and another one was stabbed to death. But of course, the Inquisition exacted a terrible revenge on the people in those cities. So in the case of the inquisitor who was stabbed, no less than 42 people were rounded up and burned at the stake for being involved or being aware in some way of that plot. The Inquisition also used confiscated property from its prisoners to pay the bills and to pay its officials. So there was actually an ongoing need for people to be found guilty of heresy so that their property could be confiscated to continue to run the Inquisition itself. And this meant that perfectly innocent people could find themselves very easily imprisoned and condemned on these charges simply because they had money and the Inquisition needed to get its hands on that. Perhaps the most famous Grand Inquisitor of them all, and the name that is most frequently associated with the Spanish Inquisition, is that of Thomas de Torquemada. Now, he was a Dominican friar who had known Isabella since she was a child. He had been close to her for all those years and been part of her inner circle. He served as one of her confessors, so he was very influential in shaping her personal understanding of what Christianity required of her, but he also had very strong opinions on what her duties were as a monarch, what duties she had to fulfill on behalf of Christianity, given the unique position of power that she had. It's hardly surprising that 2 years after the Inquisition began, Isabella appoints Thomas de Torquemada as the Grand Inquisitor, the highest official of the Inquisition in charge of all of its operations. And he's very much responsible for systematizing how it works, of branding it, if you like, and giving it its distinctive mechanisms and ways of operating. Under his leadership, between 1483 and 1489, many scholars agree that at least 2,000 people were burned at the stake. More than 15,000 received lesser penalties in this very short 6-year period. He's also infamous for codifying the crimes that the Inquisition would investigate and the methods of torture that it was going to use. Within 20 years, by 1500, the problem of conversos had all but been eliminated. And by that we mean that most of the successful Jewish Christian families, the ones who had stuck their necks out because they'd acquired wealth or they'd acquired power, they'd been wiped out, or they'd been so punished and excluded that they were no longer a factor to worry about. And the tyranny of the Inquisition actually reached the Pope's ears in Rome. That there were so many people that were absolutely horrified by the methods that were being used, by the corruption, by the lack of appeal, the severity of the punishments, that these accusations were reaching the Pope. And he actually attempted to moderate the Spanish Inquisition. This is a surprising thing, right? Because we imagine that the Inquisition was something that the Pope would have been very much in support of, but he's actually appalled by the reports that are reaching his ears, and he reaches out to Isabella and Ferdinand and actually tries to rein it in. It's actually in 1482 that Pope Sixtus makes his first attempt to put a stop to the Inquisition. And this is only 1 year after it kicks off, using permission that he had granted. So there's a quote that the Pope makes about the Inquisition in that year, which I'm going to read to you. "Many true and faithful Christians, because of the testimony of enemies, rivals, slaves, and other low people, and still less appropriate, without tests of any kind, have been locked up in secular prisons, tortured and condemned like relapsed heretics, deprived of their goods and properties, and given over to the secular arm to be executed, at great danger to their souls, giving a pernicious example and causing scandal to many." So to translate this, the Pope is saying, whoa, like what you guys are doing is so awful that it's actually going to give Christianity a bad name, that you're killing innocent people and you're creating something monstrous in the name of religion. And this is a problem. The Pope demanded that people who were accused should actually get to hear the names of their accusers, and that bishops, church officials who were answerable to the Pope, should be involved in the Inquisition. So the Pope wanted to actually have a say in what was being done and how. The Pope also disapproved of the Inquisition's obsession with public punishment. And he thought, if someone confessed and repents, that should be the end of it. There's no need for this public ritual of condemning them and punishing them in front of a crowd. This is unnecessary. Now, the Pope writes to Isabella and Ferdinand, and he expresses these concerns. And it's actually King Ferdinand who writes back angrily to the Pope. And he basically says, "Stay out of Spanish business. You have no idea what our problem is here. The Inquisition is a Spanish tool devised for dealing with a Spanish problem. And we understand what is the nature of the conversos and these secret enemies amongst us, and we understand what we need to do to fix it. So you need to stay out of it. Now, there were a few months of angry standoff in which the Pope insisted that the church's authority was highest, and Ferdinand was saying that the Spanish Inquisition was under the authority of the Spanish state, and therefore under himself, not the Pope. Eventually, the Pope backs down, and some scholars say that this was likely because he knew that he was probably going to need military help from Ferdinand and Isabella against the encroaching Ottoman Empire. And so for political reasons, with this power struggle between whose authority should be highest, the Pope backs away, and the Spanish Inquisition continues. While estimates of the total number of victims of the Spanish Inquisition are much debated, it's ultimately the bureaucracy, the organization of it, that I find so very chilling. The anonymity of accusations, the ease with which people could accuse each other for the smallest of pretenses or grudges, and the awful punishments inflicted on people who had no defense and no way of appealing or proving their innocence. And there was also this overwhelming pressure to bow and pay lip service to a religious ideology in public that is deeply chilling. Some scholars have called the Inquisition a rehearsal for modern totalitarianism, and I'm inclined to agree. The public theater aspect of the auto da fe was a way for the Inquisition to demonstrate its power and to terrify the population, and it was in large cities where the Inquisition did its most horrifying work. Curiously, though, in the Spanish countryside, in rural areas that were more isolated, with smaller communities that were more tightly knit, the Inquisition was far less successful. And in many cases, it was because people were inherently distrustful of outsiders, and their bonds were so tight that when a stranger, an inquisitor, came to their town and invited them to accuse themselves and each other, they were much more likely to remain silent. And with no accusations to go on, the Inquisition had no evidence to work with. They couldn't start any files on anybody because no one was coming forward with accusations that they could use. This reveals a critical lesson, that the terror of the Inquisition relied on individual participation. Where fear, jealousy, or hatred were plentiful, the Inquisition thrived. But where people believed in each other more than they feared their neighbors, the fuel for this horror dried up. We can see similar awful mechanics at work in the surveillance systems that were developed in the USSR. People were encouraged to report on their neighbors, to call up and inform on any activity or word or gesture that seemed at all suspicious or in violation of the political ideology of the day. And people hoped that by serving as informers, they could prove their loyalty and buy themselves some modicum of safety. But in fact, with so many people secretly informing on each other, each individual only fueled the horror and the oppressive darkness of the system that menaced all of them. There is actually a direction given to Soviet secret police who were busy assembling files on citizens. And I quote, this was from a Soviet secret police chief in the early 20th century. And he said, "Do not look in the materials you have gathered for evidence that a suspect acted or spoke against the Soviet authorities. The first question you should ask him is what class he belongs to. What is his origin, education, profession? These questions should determine his fate. This is the essence of the Red Terror." In many ways, this reveals exactly how the Inquisition operated toward Jewish Christians in Spain. They were condemned not for something they had said or believed or done, but simply for who they were, as members of this community that was so much resented and despised by other people in Spain. Membership in that group alone determined their fate and was enough to be taken as evidence of their guilt. And for many years after the Inquisition, Spain became obsessed by this idea of pure blood and of tracing someone's lineage many generations back to see if they were at all connected to a Converso family somewhere in their history. And if it was found that you were, then you could, even centuries later, be excluded from membership in certain guilds and certain associations. So this obsession with just membership, with ethnic belonging in a certain group, runs right at the heart of the Spanish Inquisition, and we can't possibly understand it without recognizing that fact. In truth, conversos were all but eliminated after the first 20 years of the Inquisition being in operation. And then it became a monster in search of a mission. And so it expanded its scope to deal with Protestant heretics and other types of people who had wrong beliefs, and eventually Muslims who had ostensibly converted to Christianity, and others. It finally was ended in 1834 after an astonishing 350 years of operation. The Inquisition isn't just an awful chapter in Spanish history. It's not some sort of horrifying relic of how people used to be. The Inquisition is a historical monument to the dangers of fusing church and state. When the government is in the business of investigating right thought and belief in the inner lives of its citizens, only terrifying things can result. But the monster of the Inquisition was born out of a vision that Isabella and her husband Ferdinand had of a state that was united by a very deep sense of identity. Citizens united by loyalty to one set of monarchs and also to a shared set of religious values. It's a powerful and attractive vision. It's one that is compelling. And this vision of religious correctness linked with ethnic purity was something that was going to be forcibly imprinted on each one of its citizens. Such a vision can only end in violence. I hope you found this episode on the Spanish Inquisition enlightening. And if you have enjoyed it, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a 5th and final episode in the Ferdinand and Isabella series coming very soon. You can catch the podcast as an audio file if it's more convenient to listen to when you're driving or cooking. You can get that anywhere you listen to audio, including Spotify. And if you prefer the video version with images, you can find that on YouTube by searching for Villains and Virgins podcast or my name, Eva Schubert. I'll see you in the next episode.